Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can find and subscribe to this podcast via Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our site, vmspod.com, to find more information, as well as our RSS feed, which you can plug into any podcatcher so you never miss an episode of the Virtual Memories Show. You can also follow me on Blue Sky, Instagram, and YouTube, where I go by vmspod, and subscribe to my semi-weekly newsletter at buttondown.com/vmspod. Well, this morning, a pharma industry podcast posted the list of their 20 most downloaded episodes to celebrate posting their 200th. And the one I guested on this spring came in at number 3, behind a guy talking about manufacturing lipid nanoparticles. I will try harder next time I'm on. I have fun on these shows, talking about industry stuff, government affairs, federal policy, and that general vibe with a pretty loose and entertaining delivery. I sling a lot of yang, which most people don't do in this sort of corporate world. I do my best not to throw anyone under the bus, but the sessions are fun, and it's a hoot to hear from listeners like a year or two later that, I listened to the podcast, I never know which one they're talking about. And, but it is entertaining. It's good to be a guest. What with all the time I spend being a host, you know? I mean, getting interviewed by Hunter Prosper a couple of weeks ago for his Stories from a Stranger series was pretty neat because, while I do a lot of talking in these episodes during the conversations, it's different being the subject, I guess. Also, I hope some people put me on their shows or interview me for their newsletters next year when I get the crowdfunder going for my book. But, man, I just can't believe the lipid nanoparticle guy came out ahead of me. I am so bummed out right now. I can't even tell you. But in the meantime, I'm off to New York this morning. I got a client event, and then I'm on to the FDA in Washington the next day. It's mid-December and things should be slowing down, and I keep pretending that I'm going to slow down and really pick my spots, but that is clearly just not the case. So I may as well cop to the fact that I have not learned to slow down yet. I guess I could make that my New Year's or birthday resolution, or just keep things going until the wheels fall off. But we'll see. Anyway, let's get to this week's show. My guest this time is Morten Hoi Jensen. That's spelled Jensen. I didn't ask him if it's Jensen or Jensen, but I'm going to go with Jensen, who has a great new book out from Yale University Press. It's called The Master of Contradictions, Thomas Mann and the Making of the Magic Mountain. It is a fantastic dive into... it's a biography of one of the 20th century's greatest novels, The Magic Mountain. As we'll talk about, I just finished reading that book a couple of weeks before we recorded, and admittedly knew very little about it, nor what it signified in Mann's life and the shape of his career. I mean, that is, I knew The Magic Mountain is about a guy Hans Castorp, who ends up in a tuberculosis sanatorium in Davos, Switzerland, and that some of the characters are supposed to be significant emblems of pre-World War I Europe, but that was all I had going into it. I had a fantastic time with the novel, realized that the whole emblem thing was inaccurate. The characters are more than emblems, I'll put it that way. They breathe with tuberculosis, but they breathe and live throughout the course of that book. And I got swept up by the exceedingly weird story of Hans and his Hans Castorp, which is always how he's represented. It's never just Hans, and his visit to the sanatorium, which starts off as a 3-week stay to drop in on his cousin and winds up running more than 7 years. The strange ways that Mann plays with time, the well, again, the characters and then the strange significations of things that show up and the way Hans Castorp's life changes in that span and then the way history catches up with him. It's an amazing novel. That said, by the time I was done, I was dying to learn more about everything around the Magic Mountain, what Mann was up to in the writing of it. I'll put it that way. So I wasn't, out to get, what does this book mean? But, where did this book come from? And that's what Morten's book does. He really explores that in depth. He shows us what went into Mann's writing of it, where the book began and what it became, and how it reflects Mann's, his changing conception, A, of the novel, B, of Germany, and C, of himself, as he kind of shifted from this Olympian, non-political, aesthetic perspective to someone who was deeply invested in anti-fascism, and how his earlier nationalistic pride that he got swept up in really created this deep divide between him and his brother, also a novelist. So Morten really uses the backstory of the Magic Mountain, or the behind the scenes of the novel, to show how the politics of the world can change both the artist and the artwork, and why that doesn't have to necessarily be a bad thing. I mean, I make a joke or a comment in our conversation that artists going political tends to make for really bad art. And in this one case, it doesn't, because it's still subsumed within this grand aesthetic vision that Mann has. He keeps the art from becoming pedantic, as we'll talk about. Morten's research is just top notch, and there's no sense of filling in the blanks where the historical record is lacking. And we talk about some of the documents that are missing after the war and some of the things that would have been great to hold on to. But he gives us a full picture without having to invent. And he shows us both the good and the bad of Thomas Mann, the family that he reared, and some of the issues behind his being a father and a husband, as well as, again, being a novelist and trying to be a non-political man at a very political time, and then how he finally shed that and became, you could say, a much better artist by becoming much more engaged in the world. So Morten helps us see how one of the greatest novels really came to life in dialogue with the utter chaos of its time. And what I'm really not getting across here is how much fun this was to read. Morten's prose is, it's easy, it's transparent, and while he quotes letters and passages from the novel and letters from Mann and his brother and other family members, the sources never overwhelm the flow of the book. So what the master of contradictions really gets at is what it means to make great art, to be part of one's times, and also, and this is a challenge for a lot of people, how to change in response to the world without adopting the zealotry of the apostate, the person who becomes who changes his mind and then becomes an absolutist in this new direction that they've pursued, almost to compensate for their past life. He shows how you can avoid all that and again, make great art in the process. So the book really makes for a fantastic companion to the Magic Mountain. And it also, as we'll talk about, provides a sort of cautionary tale about what it means to live through a tumultuous era where fascist, illiberal rule is on the rise. And, we could all use that just now, I figure. Now, regular listeners know I make a show near the end of every year called The Guest List, where the past year's guests tell me the favorite book they read that year and who or what they hope to read in the year ahead. I'm rolling along with preparation for that, but I'll say if you have not read The Magic Mountain before, you you should probably add that to your 2026 book resolutions and follow it up with The Master of Contradictions, just like I did. You won't be sorry. The Magic Mountain is 700 pages long. It's an exploration of time in certain ways that will confound you for a little while as you adopt Mon's mode, and then will kind of flower and unfold into a whole new cosmos for you. And The Master of Contradictions will better help you understand how this all fits, where it fits into Mon's career, how it fits into its times, what it says to us today. So go read The Magic Mountain. Go read The Master of Contradictions from Morten Hoi Jensen. Now here's Morten's bio. Morten Hoi Jensen is the author of The Master of Contradictions, Thomas Mann and the Making of the Magic Mountain, as well as A Difficult Death, the Life and Work of Jens Peter Jacobsen. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Review of Books, Liberties, a journal of culture and politics, the Literary Review, the Los Angeles Review of Books, The Point, the New Republic, the Wall Street Journal, and Commonweal, among other publications. He currently works as a European liaison for Liberties. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Morten Hoi Jensen. Tell me about your history with the Magic Mountain and what led to the Master of Contradictions.
Sure. I first read The Magic Mountain when I was 23 years old, which is funny enough, the same exact age as Hans Castorp when he first arrives at the International Sanatorium Berghof. And I read it for the second time when I was 30, which is the age that Hans Castorp is when he leaves the sanatorium. But my first reading of the novel when I was 23 is one of my most memorable reading experiences. It left its mark on me, and was The Magic Mountain was a novel I kept returning to in some way in my mind for years and years after reading it, and I was uncertain as to why that was. I wasn't quite sure what exactly it was about the novel that had left such a deep impression on me. And to some extent, I'm still not quite certain. I mean, that's the mystery of reading and of great books and their appeal to us. But I wanted to go back and explore that novel, and to try to figure out why exactly it was it had made such a deep and enduring impression on me. And most of all, I wanted to go to Davos in Switzerland and try to see what I can't remember why this idea occurred to me, but I think because the novel is one thing that most readers of the novel always remember, of course, is the environment that Hans Castorp is in. And the very minute sort of recreation of the various routines and meals and the daily life of all the patients at the sanatorium in the Swiss Alps. And at some point I thought, I wonder what it's like there. And I went and spent 7 weeks in Davos, in the dead of winter, wading through, knee-high snow, and discovering to my astonishment that so much of the world that Mann described is still intact up there. And then I that was sort of where my journey into the novel, for the purpose of this book, began.
And they didn't do any sort of X-rays on your lungs or anything
No.
while you were there, right?
No. I stayed well clear of doctors. There's when Thomas Mann went to visit his wife in 1912, there was a similar to in the novel when Hans Castorp is examined by the sanatorium director early on. and he suggests, you better stay here because you have a moist spot on your lung. Thomas Mann had the same exact experience, but he wrote at once to his doctor in Munich, who wrote back to him and said, you have no business in Davos. Get home as soon as you can.
I'll say, and it ties into another big reading I did earlier this year. There was a distinct, I'll say, Shirley Jackson vibe at the outset of this book. As it's progressing, there's a sense of, I'm not sure Hans Castorp really understands what's going on here, and how he's going to end up getting drawn in, which you could have taken into a much stranger horror genre, but
sure.
Mann takes in a very different direction. The other comparison is that I read Musil for the first time this year, and what occurred to me there was there's actually a noir crime thriller happening under this that I'm not sure he got. Like, by the time you get to the second book and there's the faked will and all this other stuff, I'm like, yeah, it's possible Ulrich is just the good-looking patsy who's actually being manipulated by femme fatale everywhere. And I think that might have been a more interesting book than what Musil ended up writing. But
right, there's a huge overlap between those novels in some respects, because I think, Musil kind of resented Mann for various reasons, although Mann was quite supportive of Musil, which may have been some source of frustration to him. But I think that The Man Without Qualities, like Hermann Brock's The Sleepwalkers, those two novels are to some degree inconceivable without The Magic Mountain. This is a very short-lived but very fruitful genre in the European novel in the 20s and 30s. They have there's a connection there for sure.
Yeah, it was almost a flip of the coin as to which of the two I was going to tackle this year, and it turned into tackling both of them. I'd started the Magic. Excuse me.
That's a good year of reading.
Oh, yeah. There's the extracurricular reading I do, and then there's all the podcast reading. And so extracurricular was I am going to read The Man Without Qualities, one chapter every morning and get through that. And then had let me start The Magic Mountain, and then got the notice of your book coming out and thought, oh, well, that's going to be perfect timing, or so I hoped. So
fantastic.
I think that puts me in good shape. No idea what to tackle next year. The previous year was Knausgaard, which is a very strange project to undertake. I don't know. But anyway, we'll talk about your book instead. How did the process of The Master of Contradictions change your understanding of The Magic Mountain, or your understanding of Mann, or both?
I think it made, obviously, sort of it made me appreciate the novel so much more, because it gave me the opportunity to really select parts of the novel that I most enjoyed, and kind of get my hands dirty with ink in analyzing them and figuring out why they appeal to me and how they work and so forth. But I think that it really made me appreciate the level of Mann's artistry. Especially his use of the leitmotif, the way that he has certain phrases that he uses throughout this novel that work in these extraordinarily calculated ways to signal to the reader what a character might be thinking while that character is actually thinking of something else. And this web of associations that he weaves through the novel. Because when you read about how he wrote the novel, it was filled with interruptions, and there was mainly the First World War, but other interruptions too. And so when you read about how he wrote it, you sort of wonder, how on earth did he manage, despite all that, to complete a novel that is so carefully, whose inner workings are so carefully attuned and so intricate. And so from looking at some of the chapters and sections of the novel that I really love, it taught me to appreciate and understand even the sections of the novel where I was more puzzled than before. For instance, on a chapter of the novel that it took me many years to resign myself to, which is, I think it's called Research. And it's when Hans Castorp has, he's already stayed beyond his 3 weeks, and he undertakes a kind of self-taught crash course in human physiology and biology and chemistry. And he reads all these science books, and he wants to figure out what exactly life is. What does it consist of? And I always found this chapter sort of like, mind, head-rubbingly boring and strange. And I just always wanted to skip through it. But I realized that it works as a kind of metaphor for the entire novel. And it felt like something clicking into place when I realized that. That in fact, this strange chapter that I always wanted to skip is really a long metaphor for the way that the novel itself works. And that led to a kind of a larger understanding of, or appreciation for how mysterious and alchemical this novel really is. And I've always felt that when you try to describe how it works to someone, it sounds very unlikely. There's something about this novel that seems to me like it shouldn't work, but it somehow mysteriously does. And that's I think that's what it more than anything taught me to really appreciate.
Are there, I'll say, aspects of reading it at 23 and 30, not in terms of your literary foundation or upbringing, but simply in terms of maturity that you may have been missing until reading it as an older man?
Yeah, I think so. I think simply, that there's an intensity of the kind of reading experiences you have when you're very young,
Sure.
which I think are hard to replicate because there's a level of naivete there as well. And when I think back to that reading experience, I think, oh man, there was so much that was lost on me. But I can also see the way in which the initial attraction to the novel has remained more or less steady. And that what I was doing when I was writing The Master of Contradictions wasn't really, changing my view of the novel so much as really deepening my initial 23-year-old self's reading of the novel. Yeah. Perhaps even just prolonging that experience. Because I can see the continuity between my across my life and the things that attracted me to it and to literature in general and my sort of my various concerns. I can see the thread connecting that.
Did you have embarrassing marginalia from those earlier readings that you kind of cringe about? I'm asking for a friend, of course.
Of course. You know what? It's funny. When I first read it in Danish, and it's this 2-volume edition, and I've sort of never really gone back and looked through it because I think partly because of some of that marginalia. Because I think exactly why. but yeah. but I'm also because I mistreat all my books. I underline very zealously, and I dog ear and I write, and so in some ways I make my books very difficult for me to reread. But particularly something I read at 23. So I do. It would be interesting to go back and look, because I still have that edition, of course, and see what how bad was it really back then.
We were all young. That's always the way to write it off, and to hope that you don't have a literary biographer yourself down the line who's going to be going through your marginalia. So
I highly doubt it.
Fingers crossed. Yeah. So beyond the continuity of your life over the course of reading and rereading it, How did Mon change over the course of writing it? I mean, it's part of what the book is about, that transformation he undergoes. How do you characterize that?
It's a very dramatic change that he undergoes. I mean, it's partly explained by what happens to the world, of course, in a larger sense, because he lives through the First World War, and I would say that when he begins writing the Magic Mountain, he's at a bit of a crossroads in a literary sense, because he's about 36 years old, and he's already, I think, no, 38 years old. And he's already, a well-established and widely respected and well-known author in Germany, because he wrote Buddenbrooks at the age of 25, 26. And that book went on to become a very unlikely but enormous bestseller in Germany. And he's recently written Death in Venice, which has also given him a kind of a new lease on fame. And yet his second novel, Royal Highness, did not do very well with critics. So he's at a bit of a crossroads, and in his letters to his older brother Heinrich, who was also a novelist, he envies Heinrich very much that he has always been a far more politically engaged writer, because it meant that he had a kind of more or less consistent worldview. And so Mon is at a bit of a crisis artistically and existentially, and then the First World War breaks out, and very surprisingly, he becomes he's swept up in the war enthusiasm, like many writers were at that moment. It should be said in his defense, even a pacifist like Stefan Zweig was not immune when the war broke out to feelings of patriotism and so forth. But with Mon, it goes on, and it becomes a very strange obsession. It leads to a break with his brother. They don't speak for 7 years, because his brother Heinrich is a liberal Democrat and is very critical of the war in general, but especially also of Germany's conduct in the war. And for Mon, it all gets wrapped up with German cultural history, and it becomes as much of a culture war and a fraternal war as it is a real war in his mind. And he sets aside the manuscript of the Magic Mountain in 1915 and dedicates himself to writing this very strange and fascinating and in some ways repugnant book called Reflections of a Non-Political Man, which is an argument with himself, with Heinrich, and a kind of autobiography and a political tract and so on, which is then published on the eve of Germany's capitulation. And after these war years that have been very bitter, and there's been an Allied goods have not been able to get into Germany, and so there's been a lot of starvation, and regular day-to-day goods are very hard to get a hold of. Very bitter years. He's sort of a little bit fed up with all that, and he eventually goes back to the Magic Mountain manuscript. And then in the course of finishing the novel between 1919 and 1924, two things happen. One is that Germany descends into a sort of a state of civil war, and Mon sees a lot of the political violence because he's in Munich, which is of course where the Nazi Party first gains ground, and then Mon comes out in 1922 and embraces the Weimar Republic and embraces democracy, and warns Germany's youth about against the threat from the National Socialists, which are not yet called National Socialists at that point. And this is a kind of, to everyone following his writing, this is a kind of political 180. And all his former conservative and more right-leaning friends or colleagues are sort of shocked. But he embraces democracy, and that's really where his later anti-fascism, I think, begins. Because one of the things that inspires this public speech in 1922 is the assassination of Walter Rathenau, the German foreign minister at the time, and who was a well-known person in literary circles as well. So he's horrified by what he sees Germany becoming, and undergoes this profound change.
You mentioned his right-wing, erstwhile friends, but also, we'll say, comments from writers who felt that his shift was sort of the with the wind, I guess. It was sort of the waveringness of the non-political man. Man, M-A-N, not man.
Yeah.
Do you, what's your take on it? Do you feel that's a valid complaint? Do you feel ultimately what he transforms into, regardless of how, we'll say, potentially fickle it was at the beginning, turns out to be meaningful?
Yes, I think it was courageous of him, because when you look at, the social class that he came from, when you consider where he came from and his prior non-political kind of stance and so forth, he was a very unlikely candidate for anti-fascism. Many other people in his kind of social class, and with his sort of reservations, let's say, about parliamentary democracy, they went along for as long as they could with the Nazis, or they held their nose and supported the Weimar Republic and so on. But Thomas Mann did not do that. He took a stand early on and never really wavered from it. And he did it at a time in which right-wing violence was, endemic to German society. And he faced a lot of criticism. He faced, later on, a lot of physical threats. And I'm not sure he ever knew it, but if he had not left, or if he had not happened to be outside of Germany in 1933 when Hitler comes to power and the Reichstag fire occurs, he would have been sent to Dachau, the concentration camp outside Munich. There's evidence of an arrest order. So no, I think his politics are always kind of strange, because he's not really a political thinker in any straightforward sense. And all of his political statements and essays are also kind of wrapped up with his own eccentricities and his he doesn't come at politics in a straight and narrow way. He sort of comes at it in these very Mann-like roundabout ways. So it's never nothing is ever really straightforward with him. But I've always, the more I researched this book and Mann's later anti-fascism, especially in the 30s and 40s, the deeper my admiration for his courage became.
Yeah, what surprised you the most in the research itself? What was the moment you had the holy crap, this is why I'm doing this book?
I think years ago, when I was first doing the initial research, I don't think I ever really realized or had put together, because the Magic Mountain, you think a remote Swiss alpine village, snow, and then I was reading Mann's diaries, And he's sitting there in Munich during the Bavarian Social Revolution and the right-wing crackdown on it in April and May 1919. He's working on the Magic Mountain manuscripts while he hears gunfire and explosions in the distance.
Yeah.
So you have literally bombs going off and machine gun fire while Thomas Mann is sitting there working on the Magic Mountain. And that's when I felt, okay, there's a very direct way in which this novel is actually wrapped up with what is going on in Germany at the time. And it's not this remote story or fairy
fable
tale
or something.
Yeah. So I think that was my holy shit moment.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's that sense, to me, political art can be some of the most stultifying art there is. That the novel itself, this novel, is political and not political. It's political, but beyond, what he manages to achieve with it. So.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I would never describe this as a political novel because it's so many other things at the same time. I think my argument in the book is that the novel reflects some of the political tensions that Mann was working through at the time. But no, it's certainly not reducible to any clear political message. The novel is way too ambiguous for that to be the case.
I'll say the other weird thing, and you mentioned, the characters of Nafta and Settembrini, who have the big intellectual fights throughout the novel. Do you get a sense that Mann is also telling us how weary or wearying that is? I mean, the other attendees find themselves tuning out at times, and yet these guys are still going strong. And it's like sort of signaling to the reader that, yes, these arguments are absolutely critical. And yet, it almost becomes more pedantic than artistic in a way that seems deliberate. That he's sort of showing us, look, this is what these people are going to be like. These arguments are just going to go on, and everybody else is going to tune out. So.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Hans Castorp, even he, he's the only one who has any real interest in these arguments.
Yeah,
throughout the book.
Yeah, he also has the, oh God, they're going on.
Exactly, and he begins to refer to them as my two little chatterboxes.
Yeah.
Later on in the novel. And of course, the kind of 11th hour character of Mynheer Peppercorn, this really funny Dutchman who is incapable of completing a sentence, but has this very strong, forceful personality. He sort of reduces them to these little chatterboxes by the sheer force of his inarticulate personality, and that also, I think, distances or ironizes them positionally in the novel in some sense.
Yeah. So my two big structural questions for this one, and I again just finished my first reading of the book. You can tackle whichever one you want to get at first. One is how frantic the last 100+ pages are, which you sort of get into in terms of the way time dilates and then contracts, and we all feel that sort of thing, but how that worked for you. The other big weird one for me was the narrative voice breaking down later in the book, going from that third person omniscient-ish vibe to this weird first person plural, where it becomes a we here at the senator. It's not quite as severe as The Possessed in Dostoevsky, where you get that for like 400 pages, and then suddenly that narrator is part of the action and just running from house to house. And it's like, no, that's the guy narrating the book, not actually an actor. Whatever, that's cool. Tackle either of those or both if you feel like discussing sort of how the novel works and changes mode. So.
Yes, I mean the narrator is a very fascinating sort of structural choice and voice, because it's there from the very beginning, of course, with the foreword, where
Sure.
there is this we, and it reappears throughout the novel in this sort of coquettish way. Um, I think it adds to the fable or fairy tale nature um, of the Magic Mountain, um, and adds to the sense of mystery of what exactly this story is. Is it really just the story of a young engineer who in 1907 goes to Davos, or is it all these other things that the narrator teasingly suggests it might be, like a descent into the underworld, or a fairy tale with kind of Wagnerian overtones? So I think that's partly why um, that narrative voice works so well. The franticness of the last 100 pages, I think, partly reflects that they were written fairly quickly, because the yeah, it's very unfortunate, but the manuscript of the Magic Mountain is presumed destroyed during the Second World War.
That
I
was
think
one of the questions I was going to ask reading the book. I'm like,
yeah,
the
I
thing
figure.
you wish you had, but obviously
Yeah. Oh,
the
I
manuscript
wish.
would have been it.
Oh,
Yeah.
I wish.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's officially listed as missing, and there is a whole intriguing kind of mystery there. But in any case, we don't have it.
Mm-hmm.
At Yale's Rare Book Library, there's 80 discarded pages from the manuscript that are intact. But we don't know exactly when he wrote what. I mean, we do know that probably Mann had written up until the Hippe chapter before the First World War, or before he put it aside in 1915. So roughly a quarter of the novel, I think. But the thing is, he revised everything when he resumed writing the novel in 1919. Um, but I still think you can, traditionally you kind of the two volumes, when it was published in two volumes in 1924. I think the point at which the first volume ends is after the Walpurgisnacht chapter, which also does feel like a sensible place to kind of,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
part
That's
one.
very much a turning point for
Exactly.
everything. Yeah.
Exactly. Because that's when he consummates his relationship with Claudia Chauchat, and he first kind of breaks with Settembrini, and then very shortly after that, shortly after the Walpurgisnacht chapter, you meet Nafta for the first time, which definitely changes the novel. But he did write the last parts of the novel pretty quickly in 1923 and 24. So I think partly that explains it, and also the sense of time. The way it works in the novel is very interesting, because I think it's like almost the first half of the novel is still in the first few months of Hans Castorp's arrival, and then time really accelerates towards the end of the novel. So it also is a way of playing with the reader's sense of time and expectations.
And yet it's all foreshadowed in that foreword, as you mentioned, that we all know what that terminal point is going to be.
Exactly.
That the war is coming and no one sees it. And
yeah.
That sense of rewriting, I'd also wondered, and that's what kills me about the manuscript, how much he had to go back, given how much he changed from the person he was, at the beginning of writing the book, to what he became. How much was linear progress, and how much was, going back and fitting it all together.
Yeah, we do know that he wrote that foreword after he, of course, because it announces the war as the turning point. But he added that foreword in 1919, in the summer of 1919, shortly after he resumed writing the manuscript. And that was when he said, based on his diaries, you can see that he becomes obsessed with the idea of time, which again makes sense given the rupture in time that the First World War must have seemed. But at the same time, he worried very much that the novel was too much about the world before the war, which is sort of ironic, because by announcing that there is this turning point, the novel is also saying, I was written after the First World War.
Yeah.
And I think maybe Mann didn't quite, at least initially, realize how much the novel is also about the years in which it was written. And so it's this strange kind of mirroring effect. But yeah, so we do know that foreword was added in 1919. And yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate we can't see the manuscript,
but
so
what you say strikes me, there are two things it reminds me of. One is the end, I guess the ending of 1984, where we discover essentially that this all takes place after the collapse of the regime, or that there is a voice that exists after the regime has collapsed, that it's sort of implied that Big Brother will eventually fail. But also the spiritualism scene within the book. I mean, I know spiritualism and seances were there pre-war. It goes back to everything in my life I've learned from doing this podcast over the last 13 years. The growth of spiritualism, the real explosion of that post-war, after all the deaths, after the Spanish flu, the way spiritualism took off, almost feels as though that's something about post-war life being injected into this pre-war narrative. Trust me, the spiritualism scene just freaked me out completely in terms of, why is this here exactly?
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
The moment he sees his cousin Joachim standing, and when you realize that he's standing wearing the uniform of German soldiers in the First World War, that really sort of sends shivers down your spine.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, when I was, because this is, again, one of the things I had to kind of look into was what exactly was the deal with occultism and spiritualism in Germany at the time. And you're absolutely right. It really exploded after the First World War because of many things. I mean, the sheer amount of death, and of course, as you mentioned, the Spanish flu and the general sudden breakdown of values. There was a sense of of grasping at explanations wherever you might find them, and Mann had something of an interest in this stuff, and he attended several seances at a well-known spiritualist in Munich, and wrote about the experience for a German newspaper. So this was something he himself was very interested in at the time.
Yeah, I'll send you a link to the episode that broke all this stuff for me. The Witch of Lime Street was the book about a woman in Boston who was a medium, and how Houdini was out to discredit her as best he could, knowing that he wanted to believe, and that kind of fueled his need to discredit anybody who was faking all this.
Right.
Favorite character in the novel?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, I feel like it's almost a little bit.
Instead of Brady's the obvious choice.
But, well, I was going to say I really like Hans Castorp. I always have. I think partly because I read the novel when I did that. I think that the novel sets you up to identify with him in this very obvious way. I have to say I do also love when Mynheer Peppercorn is introduced.
Like Falstaff, he just explodes the whole scene.
He's Mann's Falstaff, and after all the the intellectual debates and so on, this whole scene, this bacchanal where he gets the entire sanatorium drunk, and Mann's recreation of his dialogue, it's just extraordinarily funny, and I always enjoy that part. So I'll have to say him as well.
Okay, cool. So talking very obviously as we discuss politics and the novel. What does the book and Mon's transformation have to say to us in this moment we're going through? I will point out, by the way, as I emailed you earlier, I stopped by the Strand yesterday in New York City. I saw a stack of your books signed, which means you have been to the U.S. recently.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, talk about Mon, the Magic Mountain, and the world we're in this moment.
Oh, well, it's I started writing the book in 2018, and it took me a long time to write it, despite it not being a terribly long book. Partly because I just was having to make a living and so on. And I was living in New York at the time, and then the pandemic happened, and there was something quite eerie about writing about a novel that takes place in a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients at the same time that there is a global pandemic of a respiratory illness. That was sort of strange. And then, of course, with the increasing electoral victories of right-wing and far-right parties across the world, and a renewed sense of fear that fascism is on the rise. Working through Mon's changing political views again felt quite timely, and it gradually became a bit of a problem because I couldn't decide how much I wanted. I ended up not wanting to push the analogy too far because I didn't want the book to be about the contemporary world in any direct sense. I wanted all those possibilities to be there, but for them to occur to the reader in a sense organically.
Sure.
But of course, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the parallels. I think what the Magic Mountain partly is really about is the sense of having lived through a really major rupture in time, and the sense of living through a moment in which an old order is falling apart. And I think that is the way in which it most speaks to our time. Because certainly the world that I was born into in 1987.
You lousy young son of a bitch. I'm sorry, go on.
I don't feel it, but thank you.
You'll be 40 someday. You'll see, and then 50. Oh, sorry.
But the post 1989 neoliberal world order that for most of my life has sort of been the just the
foundation,
a foundation,
or the background,
exactly, is certainly falling away, and what will replace it we don't know yet. But I think you add that in with the pandemic and everything else, with accelerating technological change, political dysfunction and chaos. It's hard to read the Magic Mountain and not feel like it is a very not in a direct sense, but in its atmosphere and in its in the concerns of its characters, a novel about living through a major rupture in time. And I think that's why it feels so contemporary to read it today. And in my epilogue, which I wrote sort of in February of this year, right after Trump was reelected, and I was sort of, at my wit's end, and I really did not know. I really didn't know what was happening.
Join the club.
Yeah, and I sort of dashed off this epilogue that feels already kind of its moment in some respects, but yeah. So we'll see, but I do think that the Magic Mountain is filled with echoes.
Yeah.
And reflections of our world today.
Yeah, and that's sort of what I was getting at earlier, saying the artistry of it is greater than the a direct political message, but one that still comes across the deeper you read. So,
yeah.
So, what were your trips to America like this year? I mean, I hope it was largely New York and environs, but how's your America changed? I guess.
I mean, New York is always New York. I lived there for 16 years, and it seemed in many ways, in the way that only New York can, sort of unchanged. But I also was there during Mamdani's election, and so that was very much in the air, and that felt like a
thing,
a moment of enormous encouragement, I thought, and even cause for hope, which felt very strange in these days. And I was in Washington D.C. and in Princeton and also in Los Angeles. D.C. was where I think things were obviously, since it's the seat of the government, was where things were. The tensions of today were most visible. I felt very bad for the National Guard that I saw picking up trash by the river. Sort of an absurdity, and they must feel every bit as abused as they are by the Trump administration. So, and then I happened to walk past RFK Jr. one morning in Georgetown, which was sort of surreal.
So, yeah, my day job, I'm a lobbyist for a weird part of the pharmaceutical industry, so I'm down there. I live in northern New Jersey, but go down between FDA, the Hill, and various government agencies and departments. It's I get what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It can be,
but everywhere feels sort of strange these days.
Sure.
So yeah.
My friends in Canada keep having we know it's not you. It's okay. In fact, I had a trade show in Rotterdam in May and went in thinking it might be ugly, and it was more pity than anything else. I'm like, oh, okay, that's better than antagonism. I'll take it. So.
Well, the dysfunction is everywhere in Europe too. So
but I like to think we really have a lead on that one. So
yeah, okay, I'll give you that.
Or even in terms of magnitude, like I asked an American friend of mine who lives in Italy, first time around, 2017, we were recording, and I'd said, you went through this with your prime minister in Italy all those years ago. How are we supposed to deal? She's like, that was Italy. Nobody takes us seriously. This is America. This should matter. I'm like, yep, okay, you got us with that. But
well, I'm American too. I'm a U.S. citizen, so I also I suppose I should also carry some blame here.
Yeah, depends on which state you were voting in, I guess. But the thing I was wondering. I don't know if you were a Pynchon reader or not. My Magic Mountain experience in college began because we'll say senior thesis was sort of centered around the encyclopedic novel, which went off the rails pretty badly, and I never finished. I did 120 pages of Mon back then, and again, finally got to it now. Yeah. The threads of this novel that I see in my past readings of Gravity's Rainbow were striking. Only going through it this first time, I'm like, oh, Rathanau, the seances, all this other stuff seems to kind of the introduction of the gramophone and what it does in terms of how the technology warps the lives there. I was like, I don't know if Pynchon read this before writing that book, but there feels like a lot of resonances and threads here. So I will throw that out there in case it's a subject of another paper you feel like writing down the line.
That's a very interesting connection to make, because yeah, I don't think I've ever seen Mann and Pynchon even mentioned.
Outside of guys who wrote giant-sized novels in the 20th century.
Yeah,
But yeah,
yeah, but
yeah,
you're absolutely right. There is a connection.
yeah.
And yeah, the introduction of the gramophone is is an especially interesting part of the Magic Mountain, and you know, the this contemporaneous technology making its appearance in this novel, and so on. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. And again, yes, the encyclopedic novel as a kind of genre. I would be very curious to know if Pynchon read Mon. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I
but
don't recall seeing references to it in any of the old Pynchon newsletters and things like that I used to read, but I wouldn't
yeah,
have been looking necessarily. But it was, again, those last 150 pages were just, there are things in here that I feel echoed 50
yes,
years later in that book, which, you know,
yeah,
yeah, and that's sort of how we work in general is, you know, finding all those literary resonances that go on. I should
yes.
ask, also, this is your second, we'll say, literary biography. There's a piece of yours, which is behind a paywall, so I haven't read all of it, about the plight of the literary biographer. Do you feel
Yeah.
bad having chosen this as your you know, writing direction, or are there other pieces you're working on that go into different modes?
No, the I love literary biographies,
Yeah,
and it's a genre that doesn't get a lot of credit, and yet it's obviously a genre that does quite well. I mean, there's always, you know, some big new literary biography that everyone is reading.
get the Peter Matheson
And
one by Lance Richardson, by the way.
exactly, yes,
Yeah.
I know Lance slightly, and
Oh, it's so good.
that's one of the books
Yeah,
I have on my table right now. I just brought it back with me
good.
when I returned from the U.S. And and yeah, so it's a genre that many in the literary community don't really take seriously, um, but it's very fascinating to me. And I think the Master of Contradictions was inspired by a very superior book called Portrait of a Novel by Michael Gora, and that's a book about Henry James's Portrait of a Lady. And that was the first book I had read in which the author puts not the writer center stage, but the novel
Hmm.
center stage, and really writes a literary biography through a novel. So the Portrait of a Novel is the best book I've ever read about Henry James, and there's another book that's also quite similar called The Dawn Watch by Maya Yazanov, which is about Joseph Conrad. Um, and I became very interested in this new genre of, I guess you could call it biography of a novel, because I thought it was a very clever way of kind of getting around some of the problems of literary biographies, uh, you know, which tend to just, you know, be a cradle to grave
Yeah,
story. Um, and this just felt to me, and that's what the thing I tried to argue in that essay was that approaching a novelist through their creation feels to me a much more fruitful way of approaching questions of biography. Because the one thing that is I always find terribly boring in virtually any literary biography is like the recounting of the writer's childhood, because you know
yeah,
it's
it's
at
childhood.
best
Yeah,
it's first of all it's childhood, and second of all we have no idea
yeah,
what it was like for them. And it's the, you know, if you read a couple of biographies of Thomas Mann, for instance, you'll get the same general stories that have been told over and over again, and it's just not terribly interesting. So this was also a way of getting around having to do the, you know, jumping through the hoops of the traditional biographical genre.
and again, focusing on something that's a masterpiece, a gigantic
Mhm.
work of literature, but also, as you saw, the transformations he undergoes throughout
Yeah,
it. and the transformation the world takes while he's in the midst of it all. So,
precisely,
well picked, which is the, what are you working on next question?
Ooh,
don't jinx yourself.
Don't really know.
Okay.
I have not settled on a book project. I'm fishing for one, but
well, that pinch and mom thing could hold up, but yeah, go on.
Yeah. But lately I've just been reading and rereading a ton of Joseph Conrad, who's always been a writer I've really loved. And I think I'm just going to try to go through all of his books this time around, especially some of the ones that I've never read, like Nostromo and Victory.
What appeals to you about him?
I am fascinated by the way that he structures novels, the way that he frames the narrative. So right now I'm rereading Lord Jim, and it's a story within a story within a story, and he's such a deeply skeptical writer, and I think he takes the novels in the genre's inherent kind of epistemic uncertainty and lifts it to these new heights. And he does that by having, one character telling a story. And then within that story, there is another person telling a story. And it becomes this extremely intriguing meditation or reflection on the limits of what we can know about ourselves, about other people. And I'm very fascinated by that aspect of his craft. It's his skepticism that appeals to me, I think.
What was your, and this will be an insanely ridiculous question to ask, your literary upbringing? How did you end up becoming who you became when it comes to books and writing?
Slightly unlikely in the sense that I never read as a child. Not really. I read Garfield comics and Calvin and Hobbes and then Tintin. But
that connects you with Pranzatelli, our Yale University press guy. Right, but anyway,
right.
Go.
But my parents couldn't get me to really ever read, books. And then when I was, I think, 16, it finally clicked. And I think my father had given me, he'd sort of warily said, "Can you please just read this?" And he had given me Kafka's The Metamorphosis. And I read it one afternoon, and I was like, I don't understand a word of this. But I'm deeply fascinated. And then I think I just had some, the right teachers at the right time that sensed that here was someone who is beginning to be interested in literature and in writing. And so they also encouraged me. And my father and my grandfather were always reading books, and they had, Thomas Mann on their shelves and so on. So it really wasn't until I was about 16, 17 that I became sort of almost, feels now like it was overnight. Like I just decided, well, this is what I'm going to do. And I never, and that was true. I mean, I've never really done anything else. So yeah.
Congratulations. Having a secret origin story is always good. That's So the last question, which I did warn you was coming, and you've semi-answered already. What are you reading?
Yeah, so Conrad is the big thing that I'm reading now. I've also gone through since the summer a kind of obsession with André Gide, the little read French author who was kind of all the rage back in the early 20th century, around the time Thomas Mann also
he shows up in the book.
writing.
Yeah.
And they indeed corresponded and met a couple of times, I think. I had never really read Gide, but I don't know. I took the counterfeiters off my shelf and thought, now's the time. And that was earlier this summer. And since then, I've gone through a ton of his novels and a major biography of him and some other books about him. In fact, Thomas Mann's son, Klaus Mann, who was also a writer, has written a book about André Gide that's very interesting. And so I think there's going to be a long essay that'll come out of this, but I'm sort of still trying to figure out what I think about André Gide, because he was, when you begin to read about him, he's always described as being this writer that was enormously controversial in his time, and people had very strong opinions about. But then you read his fiction, and I sort of don't get it, because I sort of think, what is there to be to have strong feelings about? This is sort of decent fiction, but it's not. I don't think it's capital G great. And I'm sort of, I mean, it's his life that, in his biography, that you can find the controversy, but so I'm still kind of working out what I think and feel about Gide.
Look forward to hearing what you come up with. Somebody I have not read, but I've got a lot of lacunae in my literary upbringing.
I wish I could say I recommend reading Gide, but I'm not sure I can.
No, I'll take your word for it and just go with your essay instead.
His famous short novel, The Immoralist, is I think is actually a wonderful novel, and The Counterfeiters is very interesting. I don't think it says, I don't think it quite works, but I think it's a very fascinating novel. But yeah.
So Gide and Conrad is largely the curriculum
Conrad
right now.
Is just pure pleasure. It's a delight to read him.
Yeah, say that, and then 6 years from now, you'll be on the show with your new biography of one of his pieces. I'm also assuming, yes, we will both be around in 6 years, but we'll see. Meanwhile, fingers crossed. If you get out to New York again, would love to sit down with you in person and not even record, but at least shoot the breeze and, maybe go bookstore meandering with you.
It would be an absolute pleasure.
Meanwhile, Morten, thanks so much for this. I appreciate the time and the fact that it got me, it piggybacked my first reading of The Magic Mountain and helped clear up some of what I read. I really appreciate this book. You did a fantastic job with it. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for reading it and for inviting me on the show. It's been a real pleasure.
And that was Morten Hoi Jensen. I loved his new book, The Master of Contradictions. It's out now from Yale University Press. It did help that I had recently finished The Magic Mountain, so it's not exactly like last week's guest, Prue Shaw, where her new book is sort of meant to entice readers into Dante's Commedia. But I think it could tease a newbie into taking on The Magic Mountain. Which is to say, don't be intimidated by the length of Mann's great book. It's about 700 pages, but give it a shot. And Morten is here to show you some of the backstory and how the novel works in its unique relationship to time and to its times. Now, to check out more of Morten's writings, interviews, and other press, visit mortenhoijensen.com. That's MortenHoijensen.com. He's also on Instagram as Morten Hoi and on Blue Sky as Morten Hoi Jensen. All one word. Doesn't look like he posts anything there. I'll have links to all this stuff in the show and episode notes for this one. Thanks for listening to the Virtual Memories Show. You can support this podcast by telling other people about it. There's no better way to build an audience than through word of mouth. Also, visit Apple's podcast page for us and leave a rating and review. Every little bit helps, You can also support the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it and who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or comic or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me a postcard, letter, email, DM if we're connected on Instagram or Blue Sky, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. Messages can be up to 3 minutes long. It'll cut you off after that, so call back and leave another message if you do. And let me know if it would be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with our listeners, but I'd never run someone's message without their permission, so let me know. Now, if you've got money to spare, I appreciate it, but don't give it to me. I've got a day job that pays the bills. You should give to individuals and institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Crowdfunder, Indiegogo, all those crowdfunding platforms, where you'll find people who really need help just trying to make ends meet or get an artistic project going, covering medical bills or car payments or veterinary bills, and just a few dollars from you might make a real difference in their lives. Now, when it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank and World Central Kitchen every month, but there are a lot of other things you can give to the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, Election Funds, Planned Parenthood, and Women's Choice. There's a lot of things you can do with your money to try to help build a better world, so I hope you'll give. Now, our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You can visit my archives at vmspod.com to check out my 2018 conversation with Hal, where you can learn more about his art, his music, and more. And you can follow Hal on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. That's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download all our past episodes at Apple Podcasts and other podcast sources. And you can find all my episodes and sign up for the Virtual Memories Show newsletter at vmspod.com. And I'm also on Blue Sky and Instagram and YouTube as vmspod. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.